not many knew what blood quantum was, and that comes down to a lack of education on Native history. It's time to view these culture-specific issues on a broader scale and see how they can affect not only the individual, but also the community around them. So before we delve too deeply into this, what is blood quantum? Blood quantum was created in the 1800s by the US government to measure the amount of Indian blood a Native person possessed. It was done to essentially limit tribal citizenship numbers in an effort to essentially eradicate Native culture altogether, slowly, year by year. However, there are alternatives to this, one of which comes from my own tribe, the Dawes Rolls. The Dawes Rolls is a list of documents comprised of Native individuals in the 5 civilized tribes post the removal period, or the Trail of Tears. As you can see above, there's the Dawes Rolls for some of my family members. And if you look closely, blood quantum is accounted for. However, it's not the defining factor that dictates tribal citizenship. However, you may be wondering, if alternatives like this exist, why some tribes in the present day still utilize blood quantum? And that comes down to cultural preservation. However, in the name of cultural preservation, many Native American tribes run the risk of complete eradication, as Native Americans are the most likely to marry outside of their race. Because of this, what myself and a large percent of natives fear is the complete eradication of Native identity over time. Now, I know many of you likely can't necessarily relate to this, but I want to break down the rest of our time together on 2 different lenses. First, my own personal identity and experience, and then global application that all of you can relate to. When I was around 7 years old, I walked into Target and I remember seeing a clothing brand for girls called Cherokee. Now, I was a little naive and I actually thought that this was created by my family. So thinking that, I felt this huge sense of pride for a 7-year-old. However, as I got older, I began to learn what blood quantum was, and that pride began to shrink little by little. It's a crazy parallel to think that I was beginning to worry about that I didn't have enough blood quantum, and my family had once lied about theirs to receive more rights. I remember at my grandpa Bob's funeral, they sung Amazing Grace in Cherokee, and even though not even my grandma could understand it, I felt especially insecure about my lack of understanding, because even if my family couldn't understand this dying language, at least their blood quantum was higher. Essentially, blood quantum affected my own ability to connect with my own rightful lineage and personal identity. Now, I want to point towards something that I feel all of us can relate to a little bit more, and that is feeling like an outsider. By a show of hands, how many of you have ever felt like an outsider at some point in your life? So I see pretty much all of our hands shooting up, and that's pretty expected. Feeling like an outsider is a pretty common human experience, but that doesn't negate the fact that it can be a pretty painful one. I want to focus, however, specifically on pigeonholing identity into a box. Essentially, I want to focus on this on 2 different scales, the individual and the communal. So when we pigeonhole identity into boxes, just like what is done with Native Americans with the topic of blood quantum, individuals struggle to connect with their true sense of self, and they begin to struggle with what they feel they are allowed to connect to. When this is done, individual identity begins to be broken down as we feel that we can't truly connect with who we really are. And on a more societal scale, when we see this, the essentially diversity of our communities can be depleted, because essentially what happens is as individual identity shrinks, so does cultural identity in the community. Now, it's pretty important that we recognize this, but it's also important that we combat it. However, it's pretty easy to preach the importance of combating this, but I want to give some practical application for all of you. Essentially, what we have to do is break the shackles of misrepresentation. A big issue of blood quantum is that it relies on assumption. Historically and in the present day, dictating blood quantum largely relies on one's physical appearance and cultural connections. And that essentially is making assumptions. So when we do this, individuals begin to suffer as they begin to not really be able to connect with their true selves, but instead connect with a misrepresented version of themselves. So what we have to do is allow space for authentic conversation. Instead of writing someone's story for them, we have to allow them to be the author. Because when this happens, true communal harmony can thrive. We can begin to create our own cookie cutter of identity and begin to essentially create our own story instead of having it misrepresented or misconstrued by others. As I mentioned previously, when we do this, true harmony can occur in our community. talk to my late grandpa Bob, a former student of Shalaka Indian Agricultural School and someone I miss every day. Thank you.